Alright, this is going to be a short video on how to open up RobotC and set it up for the first time. This will also work as a great review if you haven't been doing programming recently. So the first thing you need to do is open up RobotC. That's the round green button with 4.0 on it. This is not the right one. There you go. Now once it opens, and it takes a minute, the very first thing that you want to do is check your robot to make sure that you are using the right robot and the right programming language. So you're going to click on Robot at the top, scroll down to Platform Type, and make sure Vex 2.0 Cortex is clicked. Then you have to go back to Robot, go back to Platform Type, and make sure Natural Language PLTW is selected. Finally, you need to make sure that the communication mode is also on USB only. Once you have those things checked the first time, you shouldn't have to do it again, but it's a good idea to double check the first time you open to just make sure that these are set up correctly. If they're not, you'll run into some issues with your programming and it won't immediately be apparent why that's happening. Now we can click on New and open a file, or if you already have a file that you want to open, you can click Open File. In this case, I don't have a file to work with, so I'm starting with a brand new file. Now the first thing that you should do when you open a new file is save it. And the first time you save a file, it's going to ask you, where do you want to put it and what do you want to call it? In this case, my suggestion is to find the little button that says This Computer, this PC, and you only need to click it once, and then you can find Desktop here. You can also click on Desktop over here, it doesn't matter, it gets you the same place. Now I have a folder on my desktop called Robotics, and it's from 2 years ago, but it's where I put all my stuff. And so I'm going to double click on that. Now on the top here it's showing that I'm inside this Robotics 2020 folder, and I can name this Test 1 or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it Test 1. And click Save. Now you can see that this is titled Test 1, and if I go to my desktop, you'll see that my Robotics 2020 folder has a file called Test 1 inside of it. Now if you ever want to start or open a file, you would click Open File, navigate to the desktop, again click this PC, click Desktop, click your Robotics folder, and then open the file that you want to work on. It's a good idea to name your files so that it's easy to understand which one does which. We will have several files in Robotics class. Now it's time to set up our motor and sensors. So click the motor and sensor setup, and we're going to click motors at the top first. Now the first thing you need to do is notice that you have motor ports 1 through 10 available. We only get to use ports 1 and port 10, not ports 2 through 9. So you should always plug one motor into port 1, and if you have two motors, plug the second one into port number 10. I'm just going to call this motor 1, although you can call it whatever you want as long as there are no spaces and no special characters in the name. You don't need to worry about these other things. Then I'm going to go over here and click Digital Sensors, and notice we have Digital 1 to Digital 12. You may use all of these sensors, not like the motors. In this case, I'm going to call it Button 1, and the sensor that we're going to use is a touch sensor. Now the touch sensor is the one that you use if it's a bumper switch or a limit switch. This works for both of them. Once those are both clicked or both set up, you can click OK, and you will see that at the top there are two new lines of code. The first one is configuring the sensor, saying that it's plugged into digital port 1. This looks like digital 11, but it's actually DGTL1. Its name is button 1 and it's a touch sensor. The second line says that we have a motor plugged into motor port 1. It's named motor and it's a VEX 393. Now we can get ready to start writing some code. There's a couple of things that you need to understand, but generally speaking, if there's something that you want your robot to actually do, it needs to happen inside of task main. When we say inside of task main, it means that between these two curly braces, this is where your code needs to live. Now you can make as much space or as little space as you want, and it's a good idea to organize your code and indent things using the tab button so that it looks nice and it's easy to read. We're going to start off with a simple, what is called start, wait, stop motor command. Now you'll notice how I typed this in and this turned green. That's because I put a double forward slash at the beginning of it. That double forward slash, like you see right here, makes anything on that line not code. The computer ignores it. You can type anything in here you want, and it serves as sort of notes for you to let you know like that's what this part of code is. It's a really good thing to use, although when your code is this simple, it might not seem that important now. I'll put it in though and keep it here just in case. So the first thing we want to do if we have a motor is start it. The start command is start motor. Motor needs to be spelled correctly and it needs a capital M. There's no spaces in here. The next thing I need to do is put an open parentheses. That's Shift and the 9 button. Then I need to tell which motor I want to start. I've named my motor motor 1, so I'm going to type in motor 1. I need to put in a comma, a space, and then I'm going to say what speed I want the motor to run at. The speed can be from 0 to 127. 127 is the maximum speed. Now, it's important to know that 127 is clockwise for the motor. Negative 127 is counterclockwise. So it's the same speed but different directions. And you can pick any number between 0 and 127 or 0 and negative 127. Once the speed is entered, closing parentheses and then a semicolon. A semicolon is important to have on almost the end of every single line that you have. Not every single line, there wasn't one at the end of task main. Most of the lines of code you have need to have a semicolon. Now, generally, when we start a motor, we want it to stop at some point. So that's stop motor. You'll notice that if I spell things incorrectly, they don't turn blue. When I spell things correctly, they turn blue. That's a key to keep an eye out for that'll let you know if you're doing things correctly. The stop motor command just needs the name of the motor, and it will automatically set the speed to 0. Now you might think if I have the code that looks like this, start motor, stop motor, that the motor will start and then it will stop. But what you have to remember is that the computer is running through lines of code as fast as a computer can run, which is up to a couple million lines of code per second. And so that means that it will read this line of code and then send the command to start the motor, and by the time the electrical signal has even reached the motor, it's already given the stop command, because it happens so quickly. So in this case, nothing would happen. And you might wonder why. Well, if we want the motor to run for any amount of time, what we need to do is sort of pause the program. To do that, we type in wait. Inside of the wait parentheses, we can put a number, and it can be any number, and it stands for the number of seconds that we want to pause before we execute the next command. Now this might seem a little counterintuitive, but it works the exact same way that light switches work. If you want lights to be on in a room for 5 minutes, you turn on the switch, you wait 5 minutes, and then you turn the lights back off again. These motors work the same way. This says that we're going to start the motor at full speed, we're going to wait for a second, and then we're going to turn it off. Now in real life, the motor is going to turn on, run at full speed for a second, and then shut off. This is a basic start, wait, stop command. Now you can change the wait time. Obviously, if we add a 0, it is now going to run for 10 seconds before stopping. We can also change the speed. Say 60 or 10. Manipulating the motor speed and the wait time will sometimes allow you to get your motor to run for exactly the amount of time that you need it to run before its job is done. Now, let's say that we don't want this motor to start unless we touch a button. And we have a button installed here. Well, what we can do is add a command before the start motor command called Untitled Touch. Now what that is going to do is it's going to pause this program. It's going to stop right here. Kind of like the wait command pauses it. But instead of pausing for a certain amount of time, it's going to pause until a button is pressed, and we call that Untitled Touch. All we need to put in here is the name of the button that we want to be pressed in order to start the motor. In this case, we only have one button choice, and that is button 1. Now what we have is a button start, wait, stop command. So this motor will not start running until a button is pressed. When the button is pressed, the motor will start, it will run for a second, and then it will stop. This is the basic start, wait, stop command, and it's a really good starting point.